I'm talking about our complaint to the European Ombudsman about maladministration at the European Medicines Agency. I have written about it in a new book that just came out 5 days ago in Danish and will also appear in other languages, including English. I wrote it in English and the title is How to Survive in an Over-Medicated World. Look up the evidence yourself. So this is a self-help book. I have based this lecture on the book. The HPV vaccines are controversial because there are important uncertainties. They have caused a lot of public debate, particularly in Denmark, where research at the Syncope Center suggested that some of the vaccinated girls might have been seriously harmed by the vaccines. These harms, as you know, include postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, POTS, complex regional pain syndrome, and chronic fatigue syndrome. The story about the vaccines is a very interesting one. It addresses the discrepancy between public health and individual health, and it is an example, among many others, that we cannot trust our drug regulators. As I had no interest in these vaccines, I declined an invitation to a meeting at the National Board of Health in August 2015 about them. I sent a more qualified colleague, but the former permanent secretary in the Ministry of Health wanted me to come. He had hoped that I would become convinced that there was no reason to worry about the safety of the vaccines, but I actually became convinced that it was an issue that needed further scientific studies. What impressed me the most was a lecture by Dr. Louise Brent, who had seen many of the affected girls, who were predominantly elite sports women. Such people have a weakened immune defense. Therefore, if something went wrong after the vaccination, it made sense to me that it would affect such women. In November 2015, the EMA issued a report whose main messages were that there was nothing to worry about and that the benefits of the vaccines outweighed their harms. 6 months later, we complained to EMA over what we perceived as maladministration in relation to its assessments of the possible serious neurological harms of the vaccines. EMA's replies to us were disappointing. Some of our concerns were not addressed. Several of EMA's statements were wrong, seriously misleading, or irrelevant for the criticism we had raised. We therefore complained to the European Ombudsman over EMA in October 2016. The Ombudsman made a decision 1 year later, and we uploaded a final report on our website that commented on the decision 2 weeks later. So the various documents are available at the Nordic Cochrane Center's website under News. Our most important observations are these. EMA asked the manufacturers to search for possible harms in their database, and it didn't matter for EMA that the search strategies used by the companies were grossly insufficient and must have missed many cases. EMA declared that the adjuvants used in the vaccines to boost the immune response are safe, but the 5 references EMA gave in support of its view were either not accessible or irrelevant. We investigated the issue ourselves and found no evidence that safety studies of the adjuvants have ever been carried out. EMA allowed the manufacturers to lump what they called placebo groups in their trials, although none of the trials were genuinely placebo-controlled. In almost all trials, the placebo was an adjuvant or a hepatitis vaccine. If these cause similar harms as the HPV vaccines, it would be difficult or impossible to use the trials to find out if the HPV vaccines cause the suspected rare harms. EMA did its own literature searches but withheld the results from its own scientific advisory committee. The withheld reports revealed that the HPV vaccines, other vaccines, and perhaps also the adjuvant, in combination with an otherwise harmless virus infection, might potentially cause POTS or the pain syndrome in some people. It seemed to us like a cover-up that EMA withheld this information from its own expert committee, which moreover worked under a lifelong confidentiality clause. The Uppsala WHO Drug Monitoring Center and the Danish health authorities, which had both found signals of harm, were dissatisfied about how their observations and reports were dismissed by EMA. We felt that EMA had committed scientific misconduct in relation to the HPV vaccines. By using EMA's own material, 60,000 pages of clinical study reports, my research group has shown interesting results this year, which we have submitted for publication. I cannot tell you the results now, only that we did find more serious neurological harms with the vaccines, despite all the efforts by the drug industry and the EMA to make it almost impossible to find anything. There is a Cochrane review on its way, but so far only the protocol has been published. The Cochrane authors have not planned to include clinical study reports from EMA in their review, but the results of our ongoing research can be incorporated or at least mentioned in the review, which will be very important as the published trial reports on the vaccines are not reliable. It is not an emergency to get vaccinated, so people could choose to wait a couple of years and see what the Cochrane review and other research will say. Then there is an issue about public health and individual health. The HPV vaccine controversy illustrates many important issues. It is a classic clash between public health values and individual values. The official handling of the controversy, pretending we have sufficient knowledge when we haven't, has caused many people to lose confidence in the authorities. The Danish National Board of Health reacted with considerable arrogance, which has not furthered their case. They refer to EMA all the time when they say that the vaccines are safe, although what came out of EMA's work was a flawed report where the participants were expected by law to arrive at a consensus. This is not what science is about. On its website, the Board of Health in Denmark provides a list of references in support of its position, but there is a glaring omission of an important study carried out by the WHO Uppsala Monitoring Center. The center found that the combination of headache and dizziness with either fatigue or syncope was more commonly reported in HPV vaccine reports than in non-HPV vaccine reports for females aged 9 to 25 years. And this disproportionality remained when those countries reporting the signals of chronic regional pain syndrome, that's Japan, and POTS, that's Denmark, were excluded. The center also avoided the possible influence of media attention by including only cases reported before 2015. Even so, they identified a greater number of potentially undiagnosed cases than the total number of cases that had been labeled with one of these diagnoses by the drug companies when asked by EMA to find cases in their databases. Contrary to EMA's reassuring statements to us, it is not a very conservative approach to let the drug companies exclude a large amount of cases diagnosed by a skilled Danish clinician without inspecting the underlying raw data, or to trust drug companies when they report far fewer cases than the Uppsala Center found. The public health perspective is that cervical cancer is a terrible disease, that we can avoid many deaths by vaccination, that the harms are trivial compared to the benefits, and that everyone in a given age range should get vaccinated. The declining coverage in Denmark has been described by the Board of Health as a catastrophe lurking just around the corner if we don't do something to get the coverage up. However, the public health perspective is misleading and not much in line with the evidence. Firstly, it is difficult to see a catastrophe lurking. It is rare to die from cervical cancer. Only around 100 die from it every year in Denmark, whereas about 15,000 people die from smoking. Thus, if we want to do our best to keep women alive, we could do far better if we use our resources on convincing young girls not to start smoking, rather than convincing their parents that they should get vaccinated against HPV. It is also highly effective to increase the price of cigarettes, but we have seen no such political initiatives. Secondly, what is the effect? We actually don't know. The vaccines were approved because they lower the risk of infection with some HPV strains that are known to cause cancer. They also lower the risk of cell changes that are precursors to cancer, but they're only about 70% protective against these particular HPV strains, and there are other strains that can cause cancer. We do not know if these other strains will take over and cause cancer, and we do not know for how many years the vaccines are protective. Furthermore, most cell changes will disappear again if left untreated. Therefore, although it is very likely that the vaccines will reduce death from cervical cancer, this has not been documented. Thirdly, a key question always is, when will the benefit come? It will surprise most people that about half of those who die from cervical cancer are over 70 years of age. Official statistics show that only about 12 women die every year in Denmark from cervical cancer before they become 45 years old. If we assume that all 12-year-olds become vaccinated and that the vaccines are 70% effective, then about 8 women will be spared each year. We cannot derive numbers for those who are seriously harmed by the vaccines, as the manufacturers have made it very difficult to study the incidence of harms in their trials. Even so, a systematic review from last year of the published trials found more deaths in the vaccine groups than in the control groups, 14 versus 3, and more serious systemic adverse events in girls receiving the 9-valent dose than in those receiving the 4-valent vaccine. But none of the serious adverse events were judged to be vaccine-related. I find it pretty interesting when clinical investigators, likely with conflicts of interest in relation to the sponsoring drug company, decide that none of the serious adverse events are vaccine-related. There are also reports of death that cannot possibly be said not to be related to the vaccine, at least not definitively so. In Spain, a young woman with asthma had a severe exacerbation when she received the first shot of the vaccine. Despite this, she got a second shot a month later and developed severe dyspnea and seizures 12 hours later. She was admitted to an intensive care unit where she died 2 weeks later. The judicial sentence acknowledged that there was a causal link with the vaccine. In Sweden, a girl drowned in a bathtub after the vaccination. According to information I have received from the Uppsala Monitoring Center, the girl developed symptoms within 2 weeks of her first vaccination and had a clinical course dominated by headache, fatigue, and syncope spells. She was referred to a pediatric neurologist who diagnosed her with epilepsy based upon some mild EEG changes. It seems more likely to me that she drowned because of syncope rather than epilepsy. There are many other deaths in the Uppsala database after HPV vaccination, but it is of course difficult to know whether they are caused by the vaccination. In 2013, the WHO introduced new criteria for the assessment of causality of individual adverse events following vaccination. These criteria have been heavily criticized. They make it almost impossible to detect signals of serious harm, including deaths, after vaccination. Added to this, the propaganda about the safety of the HPV vaccines has had the effect that many doctors do not report their suspicions of serious harms, either because they ignore them due to the public reassurances about safety, or because they are worried they might get into trouble if they report them. In September 2008, Ken Woods, head of the UK drug regulator, sent a letter to healthcare providers about the vaccine. The immunization program for Cervarix had just started, and Woods asked the healthcare providers to report suspected adverse reactions via the yellow card scheme, while he discouraged them from reporting faints during or very shortly after vaccination, as these were usually considered a psychogenic response to the needle injection. 1 year later, Woods sent a second letter mentioning that there had been stories in newspapers about adverse events, including chronic fatigue, but that based on reported events against expected background rates, there was no reason to believe a causal link existed between the vaccine and chronic fatigue. Since doctors had been encouraged to report adverse events 1 year earlier, and were now told that the reporting had not identified problems, the second letter likely discouraged some doctors from reporting not only chronic fatigue, but also symptoms of POTS and chronic regional pain syndrome as adverse events. The letter was sent right in the middle of the study period for an investigation that was used by EMA in 2015 to dismiss the concerns of serious neurological harms of the HPV vaccines. One of EMA's key arguments, appearing no less than 10 times in its official report, was that there was no difference between what was observed and the expected background incidence of serious harms. All the authors of the paper that reported on this investigation were employees in the UK Drug Agency. The main analysis was based on spontaneous reports compared with the background incidence, and as the data collection period for the study was the first 2 years of the HPV program, it included the period when doctors had been discouraged to report their suspicions. This was not mentioned in the paper. What can a girl do instead of getting vaccinated? She can attend regular screening. It is not ideal because it leads to many conizations, due to the many cell changes detected. But as many cell changes never develop into cancer, it should be possible to adopt a wait-and-see approach, which should reduce the amount of colonizations considerably. Unfortunately, the debate about the HPV vaccines has become highly polarized and oversimplified, often reduced to a question of whether one is for or against the vaccines. This is nonsense in a scientific perspective. My center has never expressed any views about this. My deputy director vaccinated his 2 girls, and my wife vaccinated our 2 girls. But my wife and I, who both have a background in infectious diseases, were in doubt when she vaccinated our oldest daughter in 2008. Even that far back, thousands of reports of adverse effects had been submitted to the authorities, which included nausea, paralysis, and death. And many parents and physicians were worried about the health risks of the vaccines, although it's difficult to know whether the events had anything to do with them. The scientific uncertainty is illustrated by the fact that my deputy director would also have vaccinated his girls today, which my wife and I would not have done. At our oldest daughter's 12th anniversary in 2008, we received a letter from a doctor asking us to enroll her in a trial of an HPV vaccine produced by GlaxoSmithKline. I told my colleague that we were considering letting her participate, but that we needed to see the trial protocol in order to make a decision on a fully informed basis. To my big surprise, my colleague sent me the protocol. After I had signed a confidentiality agreement and promised to return it after reading, I explained to him I had 2 reservations. There is nothing about harmful effects in the 105-page protocol, only some non-informative comments like generally safe and well tolerated. The readers are referred to investigators' brochure about this. In the information for the parents, you can read that the vaccine has affected the nervous system, blood cells, the thyroid, and the kidneys. It would be relevant for us to know what this means and what the frequencies are of such potentially serious harms. If this information is in the investigator's brochure, it is hopefully possible to hand this over to us. You cannot make an informed choice if you do not get numbers on the adverse effects. My other comment was, it appears from pages 79 to 83 in the protocol that GlaxoSmithKline owns the data and that the investigators do not have any realistic possibilities of publishing the trial without the company's permission, among other things because the company must approve publications and because the individual investigator will not get access to all data from the trial, only to his own. I also wrote to my colleague that he could consider, in collaboration with other principal investigators, to require Glaxo to declare in writing that the trial will be published no matter what it shows. It would make a mockery of the girls and their parents if the company decides not to publish the results, for example, because there were too many serious harms, or because the effect was poor if the girls were vaccinated against hepatitis A and B and papillomavirus at the same time. My colleague responded that, unfortunately, it wasn't possible for him to send me the investigator's brochure. He did not explain why. Several parents to our daughter's girlfriends had also been contacted and asked me if they should enroll their daughter in the trial. I told them not to and explained why we had declined. It is likely that serious neurological harms are caused by an autoimmune reaction where the body reacts against its own nervous tissue. Autoantibodies directed towards the autonomic nervous system have been described in patients with POTS and other autonomic dysfunctions, and one such study that you might have heard about today showed that patients with POTS had higher levels of these antibodies than patients with vasovagal syncope or healthy controls, and that pharmacological blockade reduced the clinical impact of these antibodies in patients with POTS, but not in controls. Another study showed that after vaccination, antibodies against beta-2 adrenoceptors were identified in most girls with POTS, combined with other symptoms of dysautonomia, but only in a minority of those vaccinated girls who were healthy. This comes from Louise Brent, and Jesper Milsen might have explained this to you earlier. Finally, some doctors have suggested that these girls suffer from a psychiatric problem. This might be the case sometimes, but I doubt it is common, and to postulate that all of them just have it in their heads is not only wrong, but deeply insulting as well. When I was a child, women with menstrual cramps were called hysteric. Hysteros means womb in Greek, actually. This changed when it was discovered that prostaglandins caused the pain and that prostaglandin synthetase inhibitors had an effect on this pain. But it seems to me that old habits die slowly. I hope that we will very soon know much more about the benefits and harms of the HPV vaccines. So that was all. Thank you.